I was infected with a lot of these ideas about originality or self-expression, and that you can't really make, the complete figure realistic. You need to break it up. You need to do something. It needs to be a little bit abstract, or it should be an abstract idea. And I was very miserable, honestly. I was very miserable at that time,
right,
because I just kept going, and there was no real progress being made, right? You just feel hopeless because you have no clear direction.
I'd like to thank our top sponsors, Dean Anthony and Fergus Ryan, for making this show possible. And welcome to the Cave of Apelles. Tonight's guest revisits the cave to talk about his video, The Truth About Art, and why you should discriminate between art and kitsch. He will deal with typical reactions to this suggestion and discuss whether modern art is a result of natural development or rather a product of a specific philosophy. A kitsch painter himself, he will also clarify whether kitsch is meant ironically, or if it is a viable superstructure for classical painting today. Nic Thurman, welcome back to the Cave of Apelles.
Thank you very much.
So we've done a conversation on what kitsch is before, but with your video, The Truth About Art, that sort of has become revitalized because there's been some reactions, and we'll get to that, get to why we have what we have on the wall and on the shelves. But let's just start with an update on what you've been doing.
Yeah, the main thing I've been working on now is first of all painting, and then also making videos about kitsch painting.
Yeah, because that's been really successful.
Yeah, it's been going well. So, those are both tutorials, just, demonstrating techniques, but it's also talking about philosophy.
Right.
So that's something that's been very clear to me, is that the philosophy is such an important foundation.
Right. And then you're doing that on Instagram, and you have a Patreon account as well, right?
Patreon. Yeah. So you can find me there, Nic Thurman. And
and I looked at your Instagram account, and it looks really, really nice. And I thought, I looked at the numbers, you have like 37,000 followers now.
Yeah, it's been growing quite rapidly. Thank you.
Yeah. But you have those videos on where you talk about the philosophy of kitsch, and at the Instagram account as well, or sort of more small teasers, or
mostly what I've been doing is I've been taking my Patreon videos, and then I show short clips from that on Instagram and other social media platforms. So pretty much all of those videos are just taken from the Patreon video. So it's like a little teaser for what you could find there. Right.
And I don't know if you experienced what I experienced when you make a video on like how to paint in air, then the ratings really go up. And if you talk about what is some specific topic within kitsch, then it's not so high of a number, right? But I think, that's why I think what you're saying is so important. You need the philosophy, because if not, you don't have that what do you call it? The resistance or the strength to withstand whatever resistance you meet.
Yeah, and even more important, I think, is that you don't have purpose.
Yes.
If you don't know why you're doing what you're doing, then you're just completely aimless.
Yeah. And I think that's where we're sort of slowly drifting into your video, and why that is so important, to become aware of what you're doing as a classical figurative painting when you want to do narrative painting. There's so many things that you just learn by osmosis, that you take for granted, and that you don't really think about, and that lead you in the wrong direction. I mean, should we just start with your video and do a recap of the main points there, why you made it?
Yeah. I mean, very simply, it's a sort of historical context for why these two different value systems are the way they are, and what those actual values are. So a lot of people are going to be very confused when you say kitsch isn't art, right? A lot of people think about it as an art movement. But if you look at it from a historical context, then you'll understand that these value systems have they've been around much longer than just that introduction of the word kitsch.
You need to qualify that. What do you mean about that? By that?
well, the same values have been practiced throughout history. You can find the same
but
in
under
ancient...
different names, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. So you had the ancient Greeks who were also practicing what we would call Kitsch, and the same in the Renaissance.
Yeah.
And those were based on Aristotelian values.
Yeah, and I think that is a major point, that you're not saying that, I mean, it's a matter of being sort of cultural historically correct. So you can say specifically that Rembrandt was a kitsch painter, because that's before the term existed, but he wasn't an artist either, because that was also before the term existed. And we'll get to, of course, into the different values and why you couldn't call him, at least not an artist, right?
Yeah.
So, but any bullet points from the video specifically on what you state as a clear difference between art and kitsch?
Well, I mean, very simply, they're the opposite. So whatever value you can find in Kitsch, you can find the exact opposite in art. So where Kitsch praises imitation, imitating nature, imitating, great painters of the past, then art praises originality. So you can just go down the list. Every single value you find, anything that's valuable in Kitsch, you're going to find the exact opposite in art.
Yeah, and I think you make a good point out of it in the video, that it's well, we should get into that too. There's a podcast called the Boston Art Podcast. That reacted to has two hosts reacted to your video, and I wanted to, when I prepared for this conversation, I went through it and I wrote down sort of the points that they're making, or the questions that they're posing, and I think that's really helpful, because when we talk about these things, it can be a lot of things we can take for granted, because we know the larger context.
Exactly.
But they raise some questions that I think are good as a vantage point for this conversation, and I guess coming back to this thing about imitation, and you emphasize that when you talk about this, and you made a reaction video to their reaction video as well, that it's not just about imitating like a photo.
You're not trying to make just a direct representation of exactly what you see. And that's kind of the wonderful thing about painting. You can change it, you can actively manipulate whatever you're seeing and make it into something different. You can make it better, and that's the goal, is to actually make it better.
And because this is something I can identify with, this idea that if you want to really be a skilled painter, you have to get everything exact. This is what I remember sort of thinking that in my teens, at least. That the best painter is the one who has most detail, so to speak, popularized
like the photorealist.
Makes a photographic copy. And there's one thing that one of the hosts of this Boston Art podcast says, and he talks about how, well, you're not making sort of dry representations of reality or something like that.
Exactly.
As if that, and it appears that he thinks that that's what you should do within Kitsch. So maybe clarify that a bit more. Like, what exactly is it? If it is an imitation, it's not an exact copy.
So that's something that they actually brought up many times, and I think that's a very fundamental confusion, just in general, that to make sort of classical painting is to be very dry and exact, and that's just not the case. So what they're talking about is actually journalism. So when you're a journalist, you're going to just try to show the facts of whatever you're observing. Usually it's going to be surrounding like a historical event or something like that, right? And Kitsch isn't journalism. Art is actually not journalism either. But in Kitsch, what you're going to do is you're going to try to make an imitation of reality that's even better than what you see. So you're trying to improve upon reality.
And I think also I guess an important point in that context is that the point of the imitation of reality isn't just imitation of reality.
It's not.
It's a stepping
complete
stone
in itself,
or a tool that you use in order to tell a story.
Exactly, and that's the whole problem with this idea of sort of painting for the sake of painting. Those people are going to be very aimless. And with any sort of visual representation, you're still going to have to choose the motif. You're going to have to choose certain factors that are going to bring in, what could be storytelling elements.
Right.
But if you don't have that goal, then you're not going to be telling a story, and you're not going to be really doing anything.
Yeah, it's. I'm thinking about. There's a lot of. You typically see when painters will find sort of an interesting motif. It'll be like an extremely wrinkled old man or something like that. Almost as if they have some kind of they're just concerned with the visuals of the model and capturing that specifically, but not making it into something more.
Yeah, and that's really typical.
Yeah,
and I think that's the main sort of problem with not having any philosophical basis, because they don't know why they're even doing that.
Right.
They think it's visually cool, perhaps, but what's the point?
Yeah, exactly, and that's the thing. Also, if you should be really getting into the nitty-gritty of this, of how you differ between art and kitsch.
Yeah.
That's a major thing. I guess you mentioned it indirectly in your video. This thing about aesthetical indifference. Do you want to explain that point?
Yeah. Well, I mean, aesthetical indifference is that you should not be interested in the subject. Yeah. Right. So if you have something like an old man that's just full of wrinkles, or you just take some sort of photograph and you're trying to imitate that without any self-interest other than, trying to make this dry depiction, then you're going to be disinterested.
Yeah.
So they think in some way that it's more real in that sense, which is, that's a classic art value.
Right, exactly. So yeah, you get to this sort of strange situation where you're trying to be a classical painter, but the way your approach to it is akin to that of modern art.
Yeah. And I think that's where the majority of people stand. They're somewhere in the middle, and they don't really know why they're doing what they're doing or where they're trying to go.
Yeah.
They have some sort of visuals that they want to imitate, but they don't know why or what the end goal is.
Yeah.
But there's something else I want to talk about, since we're talking about this photorealism and indifference. And that is photography itself, because the people from the Boston Art Podcast, as well as I think people at large, are very concerned with photography, because a lot of people are taught in schools that photography is the reason that art became the way it is today.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's no longer necessary to have that role of somebody imitating nature, which, as we mentioned, that's actually the role of a journalist, so it doesn't matter anyways, but they think photography is so important. The problem is that photography is visual representation as well. So anytime you take a photograph, you're still choosing the motif and you're still applying the same value system. It's not any different than painting in that regard. You can still tell stories in photos.
Yeah, I mean, you look at early photographers, or for example, Cameron or others of that time, Stieglitz, and you see how they were actually inspired by painting and trying to get that same sort of soft atmosphere in their work. But there's another thing when it comes to this thing about camera, and I was reminded of that when I listened to that Boston Art podcast, and this thing about viewing the current situation, what happened sort of with modern art, as the result of purely. It's like a sort of a Marxian approach to history. Everything happens because of just the way society is, not because of ideas, but the means of productions condition what is made, right? So they bring up the point that, and I think that would be interesting to hear you talk about, that these changes that have happened in modern art, or when it becomes modern, comes because of photography. Because then they say that well, before photography you needed craft to represent reality, and after photography you don't need that anymore. Yeah. So what would be your reaction to that?
I mean, first of all, we need to just exclude journalism, right? Because that's not what we're talking about here. And then on top of that, I would just like to say a lot of this sort of history that's been taught, it puts a huge emphasis on the photography, and it puts a huge emphasis on the Impressionists, because the Impressionists are considered, the first modern artists, or the first sort of movement that led to modern art. And then you find Cezanne, who was an Impressionist in France, and you also have Kandinsky. And Kandinsky is actually considered the first modern artist. He was considered the first person to make abstract art. Well, he is the first person to make abstract art. And the thing about both of those guys is that they knew their philosophy very, very well. And so if you just do a little bit of cursory research about them, you'll find that both of them were very highly educated.
Yeah.
Way beyond what was typical in their time. Both these guys went to prestigious universities. Kandinsky even went on to become a professor. And these guys were almost exactly parroting the ideas of Kant and Hegel.
Yeah, and as you mentioned in your video, Kandinsky wrote about it.
Yeah, no, both of them did.
Yeah.
Both of them did. And you can find, I mean, it's like, it's so exact. It's so exact.
Yeah, how is that? When Kandinsky writes, it's almost, he could just put quotation marks on the whole text and it would be Hegel.
Oh yeah,
right.
Yeah. It's just, I mean, it's expressing the exact same ideas using slightly different words.
So for our audience, what are those ideas?
I mean, one of the most important is the spirit of the time.
Yeah.
So that kind of comes back to what we were just talking about, is this some sort of grand thing that's just, it's like determinism. Is it just some grand thing that's moving and we have no sort of way to influence it? Or was it actually ideas?
Yeah.
And so the spirit of the time is to say that it is that grand thing and you don't know why you're doing what you're doing. You're just being influenced by the spirit of the time.
But then it's, Cezanne is more of a Kantian, right?
Yeah.
Or so, like very clearly Kantian.
Yeah, you can find it really clearly. And I mean, the timelines are quite similar as well, that it would make sense that each of these guys went to the universities and therefore they would have had access to these textbooks.
Yeah.
But I mean, Cezanne has a lot of clear examples as well. He talks about how the colors on the painting will basically just arrange themselves however they like. He's treating himself as if he's just this tool of like a higher power, so to speak. Yeah.
And you have that famous thing that he's saying where you should just look for what do you call it, squares and triangles or whatever when you look at nature. Sort of reduce it to their basic form, and that's the true form, so to speak.
Yeah.
And that is the aesthetical indifference, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he used over 40 colors on his palette. So that's another thing that he took from Kant. I mean, just so exactly.
Well, but Kant doesn't say 40 colors.
Yeah, right. He doesn't say that. But you should use pure colors.
Right.
Therefore, Cezanne doesn't mix his colors and just spreads out as many as he can on his palette to keep them pure.
Yeah, because I think that's so interesting with Kant. When they talk about him, they always refer to him where he's being very foggy. And the places where he's extremely exact when it comes to what you should and should not do. Oh no, he didn't mean that.
Yeah, right.
Right. But it's funny because in that the Boston Art podcast, I don't know if it was meant as humor or irony, but they talk about this thing about art being influenced by these ideas as a conspiracy theory.
No, and that's and I know it sounds like that.
Yeah.
I know it sounds like it, I swear. But it's, I mean, I don't expect anything different, right? I thought it sounded a little bit like a conspiracy theory too, to make matters sound even worse. But the truth is that you have these sort of schools, you have public schools worldwide that are teaching this same sort of history. And you can so easily find that it's BS. I mean, you can so easily find that Cezanne wasn't, a genius who just came up with these ideas on his own. If you look at any of the sort of context leading up to that, then you'll find that he was just copying Kant. I mean... Yeah,
and I'm thinking also about this. It's an excellent book called Kant, Art and Art History by Mark Cheetham.
Right.
Where he talks about, among other things, Greenberg. And so the defense for Greenberg being sort of the original thinker and independent thinker is that he never quoted Kant. And Mark Cheetham's point is, sometimes since I read it, is that, it's clearly influenced.
Yeah.
Even though it's not quoting, it's clearly influenced. So.
And, I just want to point out something which it really relates to everything here as a whole. And that is that you don't need to take all of these particulars in such a small, I don't know, you don't need to make it such a small scale, basically. You don't need to look at it as such a particular case, because all you need to do is to find what is this actually saying, what are the values, and is that parallel?
Yeah.
Right? Or are they expressing the same ideas?
Yeah. When it comes to this idea of conspiracy theory, and I don't mean to laugh at it, but I understand that reaction.
Yeah.
Because you've learned that this grows organically, and someone comes along and says, "Oh, who's behind this rock? Kant! Who's behind that rock? Hegel! And they're behind all the rocks are everywhere."
Yeah, right.
But it is quite natural. I mean, of course, you didn't have Marxists running around before Marx wrote and had influence.
Yeah.
And this lawyer then that I was thinking about, we did a dark flame on Schweiger, who talks about the German philosophy and its influence, and he writes it in 1835. And it's something new, sort of like now when you talk about wokeness coming, saying everybody are talking about it and describing it and how horrible it is and destructive it is. And that's what it's doing with the German philosophy. Writing in France from a French perspective, saying that this is coming now, but the French will of course resist it because they're too rational and they won't accept this castle in the air, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's no difference, and we know that there were figures like you have this poet and art theorist, I guess, Théophile Gautier, about the same time, maybe a bit earlier. You have even this French woman, whatever, who wrote about it and who attended lectures on the Hegelian philosophy and talking about l'art pour l'art, art for the sake of art.
Yeah.
Where that comes in, and that's already in the 1830s, right? So it's quite simply a question of ideas becoming popular and disseminating.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and that's something that they mentioned in this podcast as well. Is like, oh, but Cezanne was French.
Yeah.
And Kandinsky was Russian.
Yeah. Well, Lenin was Russian and Marx was German.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, how could it possibly be? But ideas still spread.
Yeah, and I know, and for the sake of when it comes to America, for example, we know there was a huge exodus of German intellectuals coming to America.
Oh yeah.
And bringing these ideas with them.
Yeah.
So that's just a natural consequence. I mean, and I'm thinking about in general when it comes to conspiracy theories. I mean, the Paris Agreement is a conspiracy theory, right? People meet and conspire, agree on certain ideas, come back with those ideas and disseminate them in their countries.
Right.
So I mean, it's not more difficult than that, right?
I really want to kind of emphasize the point that it's, the exact names and everything like that, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, right? What we're talking about and what is important is what are the actual values? What are you practicing? And what is behind the philosophy, or what does that philosophy have as an end goal? And so that's the whole point. And so that's why we're saying that, well, Kitsch has been around since ancient Greece, at least. That's just as far as history goes.
Yeah, those values, right? Because you point out in your video that those are Aristotelian values.
Yeah.
But then there's specific reaction to, like also in that podcast, they say or react to your idea, what you're saying when you're saying that realism was the first art style. So, and I think. Well, I wanted to get to. I mean, this is why we have the things on the wall and on the shelf here about examples of Kitsch, what the Kitsch values are. Yeah. Just sort of finish that segment on talking a little bit about what you say about art. Yeah. How can you say that realism is the first art style? Because it's old master painting, it's a mimesis of nature, there's some kind of story there at least. Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, that was the first time that you had painting for the sake of painting. So that's really important. Ayn Rand had something really funny to say. I forget exactly how she worded it. But basically, these people are just painting the most boring thing they can find in their everyday life, right? Yeah. It's whatever is the most probable that I'm going to encounter throughout the day. Yeah. So then you get all these scenes of just, people working, doing housework, cleaning, the most ordinary daily tasks that you can find. Yeah. So that's where you find the indifference. And that's where the indifference starts to become very important. Because they're just painting for the sake of painting. You're just finding whatever subject is there, and you try to make a painting out of it.
Yeah, and I guess it's also sort of political component there about sort of being engaged in society and criticizing or whatever.
Yeah, so, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think that becomes, when it becomes activists, then you start becoming concerned about your time.
Yeah, it's very concerned with the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you see them all wearing the very ordinary daily clothes, and then another point to make is that they're trying to do it in a way that's very photographic, right? They don't try to improve the models, they don't try to improve the motif or the subject, anything like that. It's just whatever it is, and make it very bland, straightforward, plain.
But that's a question too. This thing about, here's Odd Nerdrum's portrait of you.
Yeah.
And we have the Memorosa dogmas here, and here we have my latest creation. Now this is a reproduction of a crying boy, I presume. Sort of typical kitsch, what people would typically identify as kitsch. So this thing about making the model or sort of elevating the model.
Yeah, that's
what
you have right there.
Yeah, but people will then typically think, oh well, that plays into the whole idea of kitsch or academic painting even being sort of pretty and not dangerous in any way and just sweet and these things. What do you think about that?
Well, that again, I mean, a lot of the academies are practicing a very aimless philosophy, right? And so they're just going to try to make nice pictures. There's not really any point to them. So, portraits perhaps aren't the greatest in terms of storytelling. And this, this isn't storytelling painting per se, but what you find is that it's improving upon the model. I was the model for that. And I can tell you, I've never seen myself as such a handsome guy.
You look quite dangerous there.
Yeah. And it's, as far as, just making nice motifs, like that's not the point of kitsch painting. The point is to tell universal truths, which we have to get into.
Yeah. Oh, please, jump the gun.
These are the sort of things that are always going to be around as long as humans are around. It's human motifs, human stories, things that are unique to humans and that humans will experience. You have things like life, death, the birth of a child, love. These are kitsch motifs. And it's often, of course, associated with sentimentality, but you also have tragedies.
Yeah, so clarify the concept of sentimentality then. Because then again, people will think, oh, it just means, well, this is a typical sentimental painting. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
So is it? This boy?
it's very low kitsch, that's what I'll say. It's a pretty
Why
bad,
is it?
It's a pretty bad painting. What do you mean?
Why is it low kitsch?
Well, because it's not very well painted. It's not very believable. Look at these tears. He's got the milk running from his eyes.
Well, I think it looks like snot. But
yes, but it's very heavy and it's very poorly painted. There's sharp outlines all over the place. You don't really believe that there's a boy there crying.
Yeah, well, he looks bored and then there's snot running from his eyes. So.
Yeah, right. He doesn't even look like he's crying.
Yeah. And I think I guess that's also a reaction too that people have when it comes to kitsch, which is more sort of the emotional response, that it is sort of a bad negative word, or it's tacky, it's bad taste. They think about typical portraits like this, right? Yeah,
exactly. And
so,
that's,
should they?
Should they? No. That's perhaps a common understanding today, and then we have to get into the whole history of kitsch and how kitsch came around. But the point is that we should look at the values.
Yeah.
And so you're going to judge this within the value system and say whether it's good or bad. So how did it achieve, according to kitsch values, how well did it achieve those values, or how well did it achieve telling a universal truth, in a very compelling way, something that's really going to grip you and be like a visceral experience.
Right.
This is really bad at that. It doesn't really tell us a good story, And on top of that, I mean, it's not believable. You haven't taken anything here to try to improve upon. It's just a bad painting.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's one clear difference technically is the amount of attention given to everything in this boy here.
Yeah.
Compared to Odd Nerdrum's portrait of yourself, which is extremely focused.
Yeah.
And I think this is, and as such, it is a good illustration of more the aesthetical indifference, where things are treated sort of democratically, and where you choose.
I mean, the sweater here has just as much focus as his eyes, and his eyes are just completely black.
Well, actually brown, but they're not expressing very much.
But these, it's got these heavy lines. It's very.
No, I think that's a problem too. Then, well, can you say something about this thing about low and high and low kitsch?
Yeah, I want to just give a little preface and say that, I mean, this is the same for art and for kitsch, right? They're just value systems. Mm-hmm. These are ways to judge paintings. Mm-hmm. So we could judge both these paintings based on art value system as well. And we say, how well did this achieve the goals? So that's the whole point of the truth about art. You know, we're laying out the historical context as well as what the actual values are. Yeah. So how do you judge it based on those values?
Yeah, so you don't judge it on a totally different value system. It has to go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And there's sort of objective criteria. There's objective criteria within a range, right? And you want somebody who's experienced like ourselves, somebody who's a painter, to be judging a painting. Because we know how technique goes and things like that. But as far as storytelling goes, anybody should be able to understand it. Yeah.
And that's, well, there's a lot of ways we could, different roads we can go down here. But maybe this is a good point for at least one of the questions from the audience here. From a top patron, Elizabeth Freeman. How do you explain to people that kitsch works aren't always the same as work produced under the Memorosa dogmas, but that both are still kitsch? So, well, because that's one of, just to sort of wrap some more things around that question. Is there only a specific style that can be kitsch, or are there different things that can be kitsch? Like how do you differ those things?
Yeah, I mean that's why I don't like to say that something, to say this is a kitsch work, because then you're sort of detaching it from the fact that this is a value system. This is how we're judging it. So the way to differentiate in that case, I mean, you have the values of kitsch. If we make a little Venn diagram here with my hands, you have kitsch here. And then you have the Memorosa group, and of course they overlap a lot, but the Memorosa group is a little bit more strict, because we're trying to achieve, the highest level, so we're more strict on ourselves.
Right, okay.
And that's just a matter of trying to achieve that goal, right? We're trying to make masterworks.
Okay, so, well, we've done 2 dog flames on Memorosa dogmas, but maybe you can just shortly recap at least the most important ones, or the ones that you think are the most important.
Yeah, well, by far the most important, I would say, is to paint from life and to appreciate your model, appreciate the subject, treat it with love. Well, I guess I should reference this to actually say it correctly, but yeah, I mean, I would say the most important is to tell stories and to try to improve upon nature.
Right.
That's what I find to be the most important.
Yeah. Yeah, and then again, I think that's, I guess, the really important thing about having general rules and not things that are necessarily too specific, because then you can apply, then it doesn't become just one style. Because that's also I asked some of our patrons about that, like what questions should I typically ask you, or what questions do you typically arise when you say that this is kitsch, that you are a kitsch painter, and well, There's many. One thing is kitsch only representational?
How do you mean?
For example, this is a typical logic of at least later kitsch critics, that modernism, which is now old-fashioned, because it is old, it has become kitsch. So everything which is sort of out of fashion automatically becomes kitsch. So at one point, video art or performance art will become kitsch because it's not relevant anymore.
Yeah, well, again, I mean, if you look at the criteria, you can still judge them. Of course you can judge them. And you're going to say either, this is so bad that we can't even consider it.
Right.
Where do you put the urinal on that standard? I mean, so those are just going to fall at 0.
Yeah.
If you just make a scale from 0 to 10, it's going to fall at 0.
Right.
You can judge it, but then you're going to say, well, it doesn't meet any of the criteria.
Exactly. So when you have just general criteria, you're not locking yourself to one specific way of painting or whatever. I mean, you just judge it and it falls in or it falls out.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I think that's the way to do it.
Yeah.
This, in a way, the dogmas are a little bit more like a guidebook. They're a little bit more particular towards when you're actually painting. Yeah. Rather than just judging a painting. So these are made for painters.
But there's another question related to that, and that is speaking of Elizabeth Freeman's question here, if people can produce kitsch even though they're not following the Memorosa dogmas, but related to that, there's also the idea that is it only the style of or the way of working that Odd Nerdrum works with now, or can it be a different style? What about Andrew Wyeth, for example?
Yeah, of course, it doesn't matter.
Right.
No, nobody cares.
Yeah.
Right? That's the fantastic thing about kitsch. Nobody cares how you get to your result. You can do whatever you want. Go crazy.
Yeah.
You can be as crazy as one of these abstract expressionists, slap paint around. But if the result turns out really well, you tell a great story, and it's very believable, then it's still going to be high kitsch.
Yeah.
The exact opposition to that is art. And that's where you're going to have, the style and the way that you're actually painting, the process is going to be more important than the result. The result that's nonsense. In kitsch, the process is nonsense. Of course, there's better ways to achieve the result, and that's why we've made the dogmas. But when you're actually judging the painting, when you have a finished product in front of you, when you have a finished painting in front of you, and you're trying to say, is this good or bad? Who cares?
Yeah. So what about this idea then? I'm thinking about Odd Nerdrum's portrait of you. Because in the Boston Art podcast, they react quite strongly to what you say in The Truth About Art, that video, that there's, how is it that you shouldn't have a personality or have a style.
Right.
So how do you reconcile that with being a skilled painter and having something to say?
Okay,
So-called to say. Well, yeah, these are cliches, but yeah.
Yeah, well, you don't want to tell personal truths, right? Those are things that are going to be very unique to yourself. Because we're trying to tell universal truths. So it should be able to be understood by anyone from any time. It needs to be very human. So the point of making it impersonal, or that you shouldn't have a personal style, so to speak, I think they were also occupied with that. A lot of people are occupied with the idea of a personal style because that's an art ideal.
The idea of originality.
Yeah, but the point is, once you reach a certain level, you're trying to imitate nature, you're also trying to improve upon it. But once you reach a certain level, it's going to start to look similar. Because you're trying to make something that is so captivating and so alive that it's like once you get to a certain point, they're all going to start to look very similar. Any sort of personal style that you have would be considered a flaw.
Yeah, and this is something I was thinking about also reading Joseph Campbell, or when you read myths in general.
Yeah.
This thing about how the author is not even unimportant.
Yeah.
Is that who wrote the stories that you read, whatever story it is.
Yeah.
But that's not the important point.
Yeah, exactly. And you have, there's so many oral stories where whoever told it first.
Yeah.
They've been long forgotten.
Right. And there's also this thing that Andrew Wyeth talks about, right? How he wishes he was just these eyes present, looking there, that he wasn't there, but the only thing he would need was his eyes, so he could see what's going on, and then sort of recount that. And I guess in that sense, Wyeth is perhaps a good example, because he, on the face of it, he is like in, I don't know, 1950s rural America, or whatever, or Maine specifically. Yeah. But what you see him doing is to make that cow, or that what is it called, where they're collecting water for the cows there. Take that and make it an internal image. Yeah. Even though it's clearly made, it's human-made products in a factory, whatever, he manages to make it eternal. And I think that's really the essence of it. Yeah. Another way you could think about it is if you have something like a portrait, right? And you want to achieve likeness because it's a portrait. Then if you go in and you do something very artsy, like put a stripe across it, we can say definitely that stripe is not something that belongs to that person. That's a poor imitation of the person if you add a stripe across the eyes, for example, and you just make it black or whatever you want to do. That's going to be, trying to interject your own personal style, and nobody's going to be gripped by that. Yeah, but that's also the irony of it. It's not your personal style, it's what you typically do these days.
Yeah, that's true.
And that is back to the Hegelian zeitgeist, right? Yeah. So it's odd when you think really, strictly logic, to come from a situation where you're supposed to reflect your time and then react to someone saying you shouldn't have a personality, because that should be yay. Yeah, that should be perfect.
But art, including not just Kant and Hegel, but the way that the history has been laid out and everything over the years, it's become the greatest radical philosophy of all time, because they do the exact opposite of what they say that they should do, and they just declare everything that is done well, for example in Kitsch, as terrible. So if you read Alinsky's Rules for Radicals, you can find all of these rules are just perfectly laid out in art versus Kitsch.
Okay.
For example, you take something positive that your opponent does and you declare that as your own.
Right.
And then you take something negative that you've done and you say your opponent has done that.
Right.
So that's where you get these sort of things with art versus Kitsch. For example, Kitsch is it's a repetition. It's everything is the exact same, but there's identifiable differences. Whereas in art, you're going to be clueless all the time. So the images might as well be the same. Yeah.
And how many thousands of paintings and prints did Picasso make? Yeah, now you can only do that if you're mass producing.
Yeah, there you go.
So that's who said that? That's actually a major, speaking of sort of Marxian production mechanism influences on how things develop, of course, and that's where you could say that the Boston Art Podcast is also something, because of course that does have an effect. But I think the relation is opposite. First you have the ideas, then they become marketplace friendly. Yeah. So of course, when you sort of totally dismantle craft, as both Kant and Hegel do, then you get a value system art, which allows you to produce vastly, many more paintings
when there's absolutely
in the same period
no
of time.
Standard. Yeah.
And then of course you get into the mass production idea very quickly. Yeah. But I think. Sorry.
They don't even have to touch it either.
Right.
They can just have somebody else make it for them. So then you can be in the situation of somebody like Warhol or who's this other guy? I don't know. But you can be in the situation with Warhol where he has, he literally calls it the factory where people are producing these paintings for him.
Yeah, and I think also when Odd Nerdrum he wrote that in one of the first texts on Kitsch, how speaking of that Marxian idea of understanding the market influence or the production influence what is created in the marketplace, what kind of tools we have, etc. And he said, well, even though the car was invented, people still kept running and doing sports.
Yeah, right.
So there is something very strange here, because it's not a natural law that when this comes, that has to stop.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, exactly. And you can find that in so many other places too, right?
Yeah. But there's some common reactions when it comes to sort of the emotional response to Kitsch, and I think that is maybe the sort of the most prevalent. One thing, of course, is that it's a bad word or a negative word.
Yeah.
So what you say to people who, for example, read about Kitsch on Kitsch or the Kitsch Modern Art, or see this video or whatever, and go into it and say, okay, I want to declare myself a Kitsch painter, and then they meet, oh God, have you been going into Nerdrum now, or what's wrong with you? And what do they say when they shall argue that actually it's a good idea? It's like, how do you answer that in 5 easy steps to defend yourself as a Kitsch painter?
I have to think about the 5 easy steps.
Yeah, but like
it's the first thing I want to say, because of course a lot of people are on the edge, right? And it's not that common that people say, I'm a Kitsch painter, right? I would say the most common is that they're more like, well, maybe I'm a Kitsch painter, but I'm still going to call myself an artist or a figurative artist or something like that. And so what I have to say to those people is that this will give you a very clear direction, a clear purpose, and it feels so good. It feels really good when you know what you're doing and why you're doing it, and you can actually, see your progress.
Yes.
Because if you are to be infected with the art virus and you're going to be somewhere in the middle, which is where most people are, you're going to be completely miserable.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, because I remember, we all go through this, learning these things by osmosis.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, I don't know what age I was, but it was before I started with Odd Nerdrum, that because emotions are sort of, invisible, then you cannot recapture them, representation, right?
Yeah, right.
Because that's the two different things, right? So it has to be reproduced abstract, because feelings are abstract, right?
Right.
And I was thinking, if I had continued like that, that would seriously have impeded my progress or my development.
Yeah. No, and that's, I was in that state for a while.
Yeah.
When I first started painting, then I was interested in making portraits and painting, the human figure. But as far as my values went, I was so clueless. So I was infected with a lot of these ideas about originality or self-expression, and that you can't really make, the complete figure realistic. You need to break it up. You need to do something. It needs to be a little bit abstract, or it should be an abstract idea. And I was very miserable, honestly. I was very miserable at that time, because I just kept going and there was no real progress being made, right? You just feel hopeless because you have no clear direction. Yeah. And speaking also of the stripe across the face that you said, that is an example of someone saying, I'm sorry, I accept the tyranny of art in my work. And I think if you try to make something which is sentimental, as you were talking about with Kitsch, that will very quickly meet negative reactions. Yeah. And that's when you need to know that actually that's okay. Yeah, it is. And just someone saying that, well, you can actually do that, can give you a confidence and be able to stand your ground, right? Yeah. And if you've actually considered these things, if you've considered why you're doing what you're doing, and that's what I would challenge anybody to do. If you're painting, really just, come up with a response. If somebody says, well, why do you paint? What are you trying to achieve? What's your answer to that? Because I guarantee 98% of the people out there have no response. Yeah. Or it's going to be very vague and unclear. So just the experience of being able to say, I want to paint stories that are eternally valid. Yeah.
even though people say, haha, start laughing, you have thought it through and you can say, well, that's what I want.
And then they can come up with a real response about, well, here's why I do it. You know, because you want to actually compel people. You want people to experience emotions when they look at your painting. You want to be able to really tell something in your painting.
That's fascinating because it's so much a question of psychology. I remember there's a famous MMA fighter. He said he was bullied a lot in school, but then he started training different martial arts, and he said that it wasn't that he came to school and started kicking people's asses. It was just that he would look straight in their face and be present and not excuse himself. You know? It's a basic human psychology. What are you doing? Oh, I try to make... No, I want to make eternally valid images. What's your problem? If they're being sort of aggressive about it or you know, like, trying to ridicule you, right?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's nothing to get in a fight about, to get in a fight with an artist. But
what do you say then if, well, it's kind of the same question from a different angle. You're going to say that you're doing kitsch and people have no clue what the hell that is. I understand, it's not an argument, but what...
Well, of course I've experienced this a lot. I've experienced it a lot. And a lot of people mistake what I'm saying is that I paint kitchens.
Right.
But my sort of go-to response is to say that I'm doing to say that I'm inspired by Rembrandt or to show some sort of painting by Rembrandt, because a lot of people know Rembrandt and understand Rembrandt. And then, you know, if you want to go further, then you would say something about storytelling and how can you tell stories. Paintings, you know, multiple figure compositions, and what's going on with that.
But how do you explain fairly shortly that that is kitsch?
I guess the main thing is that it's storytelling and with universal truths. Of course, that usually needs some explanation too. You know, universal truth sounds really big, but it's actually very simple. It's
the archetypal content, right?
Yeah. Any movie you've ever seen that's been a little bit decent was telling a universal truth. Right.
And I think I always find it helps to say, you know, when modern art or modern painting became established, the point was that paint should look like paint on canvas. And those who wanted to still recreate reality and tell sentimental stories were defined as old-fashioned and kitsch.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And I think that's something I remember talking about it in when I did that lecture in the Representational Art Conference, saying it's a change of connotation, not of content. This new idea of kitsch that Odd Nerdrum presented. So that's fascinating to me. That people who like Herman Brock, who talks about kitsch as Satan, and it's outright religious in his rhetoric. That he can say something about kitsch that I read or you read, and I think, oh, that's true. But you find it as something positive, right?
Yeah, and a lot of those sort of common ideas about it, like saying that it's sentimental. Well, what's wrong with that? Everybody loves a sentimental movie. Why should it be bad if you find that in a painting?
Yeah, exactly. I think that you're really onto something to be able to not get scared when someone says, "Oh yeah, but that's just sentimental." Oh my God. I think that's it. That's the key of this thing. It gives you some integrity.
And I guess another common thing, like the way that I would differentiate myself from art, because I know it's very confusing that kitsch is not art. But I would say that art is concerned with everything surrounding a painting, right? All of the circumstances and the context, the story behind it or beyond it, and they don't care about the surface.
When it was made and...
Kitsch is only concerned with the surface, and you don't care about the surroundings. You want to be able to see an image that's going to strike you, it's going to evoke emotions.
Right. Mic drop. Nic Thurman, thank you for coming to the Cave of Pillars. I think this was really clarifying. And I'd also like to thank our other top sponsors, Alistair Blaine, Anders Berger Christensen, Elizabeth Freeman, Endika, Eric Lasky, Herman Borge, Hårek Jordal Andreasen, Jack Entz Werner, Jared Fountain, Jon Harald Espheim, Jose Lewis, Maurice Robbins, Michael Irish, Sean Roberts, Stacey Evangelista, Tone-Lise Rugås, Trym Jordal, and Yngve Helland for making the show possible. And remember, head over to caveofpillars.com/subscribe and check out the benefits you get from supporting our show. I'll see you next month.